George Washington is remembered as America's greatest leader. But what if his path to becoming a legend was filled with failure, insecurity, and impossible choices? What if the man who shaped a nation almost gave up before it even began? This isn't the version of George Washington your school textbook told you. Because behind the statues, titles, and myths was a deeply human man, struggling with loss, pressure, and decisions no one should ever have to make. We're about to take you through the real journey. If you stick with us to the end, you'll see how one person changed an entire world simply by refusing to give up, no matter the odds. Let's rewind to before George Washington was anyone. He wasn't born into power. He wasn't from a famous family. He was born on February 22nd, 1732, in Westmoreland County, Virginia, a quiet, muddy place on the edge of wilderness. And when George was just 11 years old, his father died. No warning, no time to prepare. It changed everything. Washington didn't get the family land. That went to his older half-brothers. He didn't go to college. There wasn't enough money. While other future founding fathers studied in Europe, George was learning from the woods. And that's important, because the man who would one day lead a nation first learned how to survive in silence. While others learned in classrooms, Washington learned from rivers, maps, and pain. He taught himself measurement and discipline by becoming a surveyor. By age 16, he was out on his own, mapping uncharted forests, dodging wildlife, sleeping under stars, building a kind of grit few could imagine now. But that skill with land and his hunger for status would eventually push him towards something much bigger: war. At 21, George Washington found himself in a position that should have been impossible. In command of the Virginia militia during rising tensions between Britain and France. Here's where things take a dark turn that no one really talks about. In what's now western Pennsylvania, he led an ambush against a small group of French soldiers. He believed they were spies. He was wrong. That trigger pull, so early in his career, sent ripples across continents. It turned out the French commander had diplomatic papers. They were peace messengers. And young George Washington had unknowingly sparked the French and Indian War, the American front of a global war between major powers. Was it a crime? A mistake? A misunderstanding? Historians still argue, but what happened next nearly destroyed his career. At Fort Necessity, outnumbered, rain pouring, his defenses collapsed. He signed a surrender document written in French that admitted to killing a diplomat. The document was used as propaganda in France. They were furious. Washington had been humiliated. He returned to Virginia in defeat, and for a while it looked like his future was over. But what happened next would reveal something crucial. The George Washington the world admires is not the one who never failed. It's the one who refused to stop. Because in that defeat, Washington made a decision that changed everything. He would rebuild himself from the ashes. He could have disappeared from history right there, but he didn't. Back home after the failed campaign, Washington did what many don't. He humbled himself. He spent the next years working as a legislator in the Virginia House of Burgesses. No glamour, no spotlight, just service. He got married to a wealthy widow named Martha Custis, gaining land, money, and stepchildren. Politically savvy move? Maybe. But by all accounts, they built a warm, respectful partnership. More importantly, Washington began building something deeper: reputation. He didn't just want power, he wanted to embody virtue. He kept personal diaries where he practiced restraint, discipline, and integrity. Washington wasn't just learning how to lead, he was rehearsing how to be. He knew that leadership wasn't just about charisma, it was about control. And by the time tensions began to boil again between the colonies and Britain, George Washington was no longer the reckless kid from the woods. He was a symbol waiting for a cause. And in 1775, that cause arrived. Before we dive into the American Revolution, here's a question. What if the man chosen to lead the war for independence wasn't just inexperienced, but also unsure? And what if that deep, private self-doubt became his greatest advantage? That's the twist few people see coming. In the spring of 1775, in the shadow of rising violence in Massachusetts, the Second Continental Congress met to unite the colonies. They didn't know what to do. They didn't even really believe they could win. But they knew they needed a leader to organize their ragtag militias. They chose George Washington. Why?
He was tall, commanding, silent, but noble. He wore his old uniform to every debate, a constant, unspoken message: I'm ready. But deeper down, Washington knew something others didn't. This war was going to be hell, and winning wasn't guaranteed. He wasn't the best strategist, but he was the one willing to carry the weight. He traveled to Boston and took control of the troops besieging British forces. What he found was terrifying. The army wasn't really an army. There were no supplies, no engineers, no experience, just farmers, hunters, and volunteers who believed in something they couldn't quite name. Washington didn't react with anger. He got to work. For the next 8 years, he would live alongside these men, freezing, starving, marching, bleeding, never as a distant commander, but as a silent witness to their suffering. And little by little, through defeat after defeat, retreat after retreat, he held the army together through one impossible truth: evolution doesn't require perfection. It just needs someone who won't stop showing up. This wasn't a clean war. It was a brutal, drawn-out, exhausting mess. And soon, the man seen as the only hope for American independence would be on the verge of losing everything. In the next act, you'll see how Washington's most iconic moment, crossing the Delaware River, wasn't just brave. It was driven by desperation. And if it didn't work, America might never have existed. But even more shocking, some of Washington's own men wanted him replaced. And the person who tried to betray him was the hero you probably grew up admiring. By late 1776, the American Revolution was in deep trouble. Washington's army had faced one defeat after another. He'd been pushed out of New York by the British. Morale was crumbling, and many soldiers were preparing to go home at the end of the year. The cause of liberty looked like it was already dying. And then Washington, completely backed into a corner, made one of the riskiest decisions in military history. He would strike during a blizzard on Christmas night. The plan was insane. Cross the frozen Delaware River with 2,400 exhausted men, drag equipment through ice and snow, and attack a garrison of elite Hessian troops on Christmas morning, when the enemy wouldn't expect it. The boats had to be carried. The ice was cracking. Some men didn't even have shoes, their bloody footprints staining the frozen ground. Every minute was torture, Every delay risked alerting the enemy. A single mistake, and it'd be over. But somehow, as dawn broke over Trenton, they struck. The stunned Hessians barely had time to react. In 45 minutes, the Americans scored what would become one of the most important surprise victories ever recorded. It didn't just shift the war. It told the world, we're not done. This wasn't just about strategy. It was psychological warfare, a signal to Americans, British, and the world that this young country wasn't going quietly. The Trenton surprise didn't just save morale, it revived the entire revolution. Then came Valley Forge, winter of 1777. It's the moment you might have heard about, but the real experience was beyond comprehension. No food, no shoes, no medicine, disease everywhere, an army freezing to death, and a government slow to send help. This was the breaking point. Soldiers deserted, officers questioned leadership. Washington refused to leave. He walked through camp daily, checked on soldiers, held meetings in the cold. He shared their suffering, ate their rations, slept on the frozen ground. This lonely, silent leadership is what cemented his legend. He didn't win by being loud. He won by never abandoning his men. And while snow fell and boots fell apart, another miracle was happening. Washington brought in Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer who didn't speak English. Despite the language barrier, Steuben whipped the ragtag soldiers into shape. Drills, formations, discipline. Come spring, they weren't the same army. The army that limped into Valley Forge became the army that stood toe-to-toe with a global empire. But just as things seemed to turn, the real betrayal was growing from within. Washington's biggest threat wasn't the enemy. It was about to come from one of his closest allies. Let's rewind for a second. Benedict Arnold, at this point, was a decorated general, a battlefield hero, one of Washington's most trusted commanders. But Arnold felt unappreciated, passed over, criticized by Congress while others got glory. He had debts, he had pride, and he made a deal, a secret one. He switched sides, a hero turned spy. Arnold agreed to surrender West Point to the British. It would have shattered American defenses. Washington didn't find out until it was almost too late. Arnold thought when his plot was discovered and escaped to the British. But the letter, the betrayal, the personal weight of it, devastating. There's a story, true or not, that Washington wept. Others said he sat for hours in silence. This was more than military treason. This was emotional treason. The revolution survived, but Washington never saw betrayal the same way again. They weren't out of the woods yet. There were still years of war ahead. And Washington, still far from beloved, would face something even worse. His own men began planning to replace him. Historians call it the Conway Cabal, but the short version? Several high-ranking American officers and politicians were secretly plotting to remove Washington from command. They thought he was too cautious, too old school, too unsuccessful in battle. Their preferred replacement? General Horatio Gates, the victor from the Battle of Saratoga. And for a moment, it looked like it could actually happen. But then, Washington did something very human. He didn't rage. He didn't retaliate. He simply handled it with calm strength. One letter to Congress, one moment of quiet confrontation, and the plot fell apart. He survived, not by shouting, but by standing taller than those trying to tear him down. That moment, quiet but powerful, reminded the young nation why Washington mattered. Even from inside attacks, Washington didn't flinch. That steady presence became his greatest weapon. By 1781, after 6 brutal years of war, the British were stretched thin. They had occupied cities, burned towns, but couldn't crush the revolution. Then, a window opened. British General Cornwallis was holed up in Yorktown, Virginia. France, now a full ally of the Americans, had sent troops and ships. Washington saw the chance. He rushed south with 17,000 troops. French General Rochambeau brought reinforcements. The British Navy couldn't reach Cornwallis. They were trapped. After 3 weeks of siege, Cornwallis surrendered. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over. It was the end, but also the beginning of something far more complicated. Victory finally came, but what Washington did after the war is what shocked the world most of all. Power, military praise, hero worship. It was all on the table. The army would have followed him anywhere. So why did George Washington do the unthinkable? Step down. In December 1783, George Washington stood before Congress in Annapolis and resigned as commander-in-chief. No one demanded it. No law forced him. He walked away from total power in a world ruled by kings and emperors. In that one moment, he became immortal. A stunned King George III reportedly said, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington wasn't perfect, but in this moment, he rewrote what leadership means. For the first time in history, a victorious general didn't seize power. He returned it to the people. But the story's not over yet, because retirement didn't last. The country was falling apart without central leadership, and there was only one name the people trusted to fix it. The war was over. The colonies, now the United States, and George Washington? He didn't ask for anything. No medals, no monuments. He simply wanted to return home, live quietly, raise crops, and disappear from history as a servant who had done his part. But reality didn't let him fade away. By 1787, just 4 years after resigning, the nation was already falling apart. The Articles of Confederation weren't working. States were barely cooperating. There were currency problems, mutinies, even whispers of civil war. There was no president, no real executive, just chaos. And the people, the same ones who had fought a revolution for freedom, were now calling for a strong central figure to hold this crumbling dream together. Only one name made sense. Again, the man who refused power was now needed to save it. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States. But there was no rule book. No one had done this before. The Constitution had just been ratified. The country was brand new. Every choice he made was a precedent. Would there be kings again? Could power corrupt even in a republic? All eyes were on him. As Washington entered office, he knew one thing. If this experiment fails, history won't remember the idea. They'll remember my name as the man who ruined it. Imagine this. You're handed a country with no clear direction. Every choice could create future conflicts or traditions. Every mistake could last for centuries. Washington approached the presidency with deep caution. He resisted being called His Excellency and settled for just Mr. President. He created a cabinet of advisors, something not explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Among them, Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State, Alexander Hamilton as Secretary of the Treasury. These two hated each other, by the way. One believed in states' rights, the other in federal power. Washington had to constantly manage the tension between them. But slowly, foundations were laid: a national bank, tax systems, a functioning federal government. The Bill of Rights became law, and America began to feel like a real nation. Washington wasn't trying to be a king. He was trying to invent a job that no human had ever done right before. Over time, he also added what we now take for granted: 2-term limits, not required but honored for over 100 years after him. Peaceful transfer of power. The idea that the presidency serves the republic, not rules it. Washington didn't just lead a nation. He literally created the role of president by refusing to be more than a citizen. Now let's pause the timeline and talk about something most stories gloss over. Who was George Washington? Really? Not the marble statue, not the money face, but the man. And here's what we know. He had a brutal temper, even though he often hid it. He was painfully insecure about his lack of formal education. He was obsessed with control of his image, his feelings, his history. He owned enslaved people, over 100 of them, and despite private doubts, he benefited greatly from their labor. But toward the end of his life, he became the only founding father to write in his will that all his slaves should be freed upon his wife's death. Why? We'll never know all the reasons, but something changed in him. Perhaps he saw that a nation built on freedom couldn't survive based on chains. Still, this contradiction haunts his legacy. He led the fight for liberty while denying it to others in his own backyard. History does not make perfect men, but Washington shows us that powerful legacies can come from imperfect people if they grow. He was not a saint. He wrestled with moral failure, legacy, fear, and silence like every great leader before and after. George Washington was the first president to confront the human cost of America's original sin, slavery, and act on it, even quietly. Now, we're near the end. But Washington wasn't finished teaching the Republic how to transition power. And what he did next changed not just America, but every democracy that came after it. Washington could have been president until his death. People wanted him to stay. Some whispered about making him monarch in name, even if not in law. But in 1796, George announced something that silenced the nation. He would not seek a third term. Think about that. There was no limit. No law said he had to stop. But he did because he knew the country had to live without him. He wrote a farewell address still studied to this day, warning America about political parties tearing the country apart, foreign entanglements, loyalty to faction over nation, division over unity. It was prophetic. He didn't just lead the country. He modeled how to leave it better than he found it. 2 years later, in 1799, at age 69, George Washington suffered complications from a sudden illness, refused urgent treatment, and died quietly at home. His last words? "'Tis well." Simple. The man he tried to be. For the second time in his life, Washington walked away from power, willingly. The world had never seen anything like it. We live in a time when leadership is loud, flashy, temporary. But George Washington, and a flawed silence and deep control, taught us a different kind of leadership. The kind that endures through example. He wasn't the smartest founding father, wasn't the best general, wasn't the most eloquent or visionary. He didn't write the Constitution, the Declaration, or thousands of pages of philosophy. Instead, his gift was simpler. He showed us how power should be held
and how it should be given up. He didn't win all the battles. He wasn't perfect in morality, but through discipline, humility, and resilience, he built something no one had ever seen before: a country not led by kings, but by principles. When we talk about freedom, when we talk about transition of power, when we talk about what it means to be American, we are, whether we realize it or not, still answering to the example he set. That's the true immortality of George Washington. Not carved in monuments, but echoed in every peaceful election, every citizen-led movement, every time leadership steps down on its own. He was the man who killed the idea of monarchy in the Western Hemisphere. And he did it not on the battlefield, but by walking away. What would you have done with that much power? Tell us below, and don't miss our Lincoln deep dive next.